The Brooks Range in northern Alaska is a place few dare to wander. Endless ridges of sharp granite, snowfields that never fully melt, and valleys so silent that even the wind seems hesitant to pass through. Out here, the wilderness is not just empty. It feels watchful. Locals say the mountains themselves breathe, listening to those who intrude. Every hunter, trapper, and prospector who stepped into the Brooks Range knows the same unspoken rule. Respect the land, or it will take something from you. Sometimes, it takes everything. This story begins in the fall of 1997, when 3 seasoned hunters from Fairbanks, Tom Callahan, Rick Porter, and Eddie Lawson, set out for a 2-week caribou hunt deep in the range. These men weren't amateurs. Tom had been hunting since he was 10, Rick worked as a bush pilot, and Eddie was a survival instructor who had guided tourists for years. They carried satellite radios, maps, and enough supplies to last twice their planned trip. But the Brooks Range doesn't care how prepared you are. The men drove north until the road ended and then flew in by bush plane, landing on a narrow strip of tundra. The pilot, an old man named Gus Heller, warned them before he left. "These mountains, they don't like being disturbed. I've flown folks out here who never came back. You hear something calling at night, you ignore it. Don't go chasing voices. Don't follow lights." Tom laughed it off. The way a man laughs when he doesn't want to admit a warning gave him chills. Eddie gave Gus a respectful nod, but Rick muttered something about bush pilot ghost stories and waved him off. By the second day, they had set up a sturdy camp along the edge of a spruce grove. The tundra stretched endlessly, caribou trails cutting across the moss like faded scars. At night, the sky shimmered with aurora borealis, green curtains rippling across the heavens. The men sat by the fire, drinking coffee, joking, and planning their hunt. But when the fire burned low, silence crept back in. A silence too deep, too unnatural. Eddie noticed it first. "Do you hear that?" he asked one night. Tom frowned. "Hear what?" "Exactly. Nothing. No owls, no wolves, no wind. Just nothing." Rick rolled his eyes. "Eddie, it's Alaska." Things get quiet. But Eddie couldn't shake the feeling that the silence wasn't absence. It was presence. Something vast and patient was listening. On the 3rd morning, they found tracks near camp. Not caribou, not moose. These prints were elongated, almost human, but too large. Barefoot, pressed deep into the frozen moss, as though something heavy had walked straight through their sight while they slept. "Maybe a prank," Rick suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. There wasn't another soul within 100 miles. That night, the aurora was particularly bright, shifting from green to blood-red streaks that bled across the stars. As the hunters lay in their tents, Tom heard it first. A faint voice carried on the still air. A woman's voice. It called his name. "Tom, come here." He sat up, heart pounding, convinced he was dreaming. But outside, he heard snow crunch under footsteps. The next morning, Tom didn't mention it. He only stared at the tree line with hollow eyes while Rick and Eddie joked over breakfast. On the 5th day, Rick failed to return from scouting. He had gone out to check the ridges for caribou herds, but never came back. His radio was dead silent. Eddie and Tom searched until sunset, finding only his tracks leading up into a narrow ravine. The strange thing was the tracks simply stopped at a sheer rock wall, as if Rick had walked straight into stone. No signs of a fall, no blood, no gear, just gone. Eddie wanted to turn back immediately, but Tom insisted they keep searching. "Rick knows this land." He wouldn't just disappear, but Eddie wasn't so sure. He'd been watching Tom too closely, and he noticed things. The way Tom's lips moved at night, whispering back to something only he could hear. The way he sometimes walked toward the tree line before Eddie called him back. And the way the silence seemed to deepen around him. By the 7th day, Eddie could barely sleep. The voice came for him now, too. Always soft, always familiar. Sometimes it was his mother, sometimes an old girlfriend, but always from outside the tent. "Eddie, come see." He tried plugging his ears, wrapping his head in blankets, but the whispers slipped through anyway, like cold fingers pressed against his skull. One night, Eddie snapped. He shook Tom awake. "Don't you hear it?" he demanded. The voices, the footsteps. Tom stared at him with blank eyes. "It's just the wind." But Eddie saw it, the faint smile curling at the edge of Tom's lips, a smile that wasn't his own. On the 8th night, the silence broke. Eddie woke to a glow leaking into the tent, brighter than moonlight. He crawled out into the freezing air, his breath rising like smoke, and saw them. Lights. Not auroras, not stars, but lantern-like orbs drifting between the trees. They pulsed faintly, as if breathing, and among them, he thought he saw Rick. Rick stood just beyond the tree line, his outline dim but unmistakable. Orange jacket, hunting rifle slung over his shoulder. He wasn't moving, just standing, waiting. "Rick!" Eddie shouted, stumbling forward. Tom's hand shot out of the tent and grabbed his arm with surprising force. His eyes gleamed in the glow. "Don't," Tom whispered. "It's not him." Eddie froze, staring. The figure tilted its head unnaturally, too sharply, like a puppet pulled by strings. The light swirled around it, flickering, before it melted back into the shadows. The next morning, Eddie begged Tom to pack up and head south. But Tom just smiled strangely and said, "We're being tested. You feel it too, don't you? This place, it's alive, and it wants us to follow. By now." Tom was talking to the empty air openly. He'd stop mid-sentence, turn his head like he was listening, and then nod as if someone had given him instructions. Eddie caught him humming lullabies at night, words too muffled to understand. The food was running low. The caribou had vanished. The traps they set came back empty, as though the forest refused to feed them. Eddie tried the satellite radio again, but only static bled through. On the 10th day, Eddie found something outside camp. It was Rick's boot, half buried in moss. But the strange part wasn't that it was missing. The strange part was that the moss beneath was wet, freshly torn, as though something had placed the boot there only hours ago. Inside the boot was a scrap of paper, folded tight. Eddie unfolded it with shaking hands. Scrawled in mud and something darker was one word: run. That night, Eddie confronted Tom. "Whatever's happening here, it's not natural. We have to go." Tom laughed, short, sharp, joyless. "Go where?" "The plane won't come back for another week. Do you even know which way south is anymore?" Eddie did know. He'd marked their route carefully. But when he showed Tom the map, the landmarks were wrong. Valleys where there shouldn't be valleys, ridges bending in impossible directions. It was as if the land had shifted around them, twisting geography like clay. "You see," Tom whispered, eyes wide with feverish awe. "It doesn't want us to leave. And maybe we shouldn't." That was the moment Eddie realized he wasn't fighting the wilderness anymore. He was fighting Tom. On the 11th night, Eddie woke to the sound of chopping. He crawled from his tent and saw Tom at the tree line, swinging his hatchet into the frozen ground. Over and over. "What are you doing?" Eddie hissed. Tom looked up, sweat freezing on his brow. "They told me to dig." "Something's buried here." Eddie's blood ran cold. "Who told you?" Tom pointed at the darkness beyond the trees. "The hunters before us. They're still here." Eddie glanced at the hole Tom had made. The soil was loose, black, wet with something that smelled coppery. He thought he saw fragments of bone, too small to be animal. "Stop," Eddie demanded, but Tom only smiled wider. "You'll see. They're waiting for us." That night, Eddie didn't sleep. He clutched his rifle and watched Tom hum lullabies to the dark, his lips stained with earth. On the 13th day, Eddie awoke to silence deeper than ever. Tom's tent was empty. His gear was gone. Eddie followed the tracks into the trees, heart pounding. After an hour, he found them. Barefoot prints again, but this time mixed with Tom's boot tracks. The boot prints grew lighter, less defined, until they were gone. Only the barefoot prints remained. As he stood frozen in terror, he heard it. "Eddie, come join us." The voice was right behind him. He spun, rifle raised. Nothing. Only the endless, watching silence of the Brooks Range. By dusk, Eddie was back at camp, alone. He tried the radio again. Static. He tried building a signal fire, but the smoke vanished unnaturally into the still air, as if swallowed by the sky. That night, the lights returned. Brighter this time. Closer. Drifting straight into camp. Eddie fired 3 shots into the air. The lights didn't flinch, and among them, he saw Tom, barefoot now, face pale, eyes hollow. His lips moved silently, repeating words Eddie couldn't hear. Then the lights went out. Darkness fell heavier than before. Eddie couldn't feel his fingers anymore. His gloves were stiff with frost. His breath hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, and his chest ached with each inhale. The campfire sputtered low, casting only a faint orange glow against the black walls of the forest. He hadn't slept in 2 days. He didn't dare. Every time his eyes closed, he dreamed of voices, Rick, Tom, strangers he didn't know, all whispering the same command. "Come join us." Now, as the night deepened, he realized something was different. The silence was gone. In its place came a low hum, vibrating through the ground itself. It was steady, like a heartbeat. Eddie gripped his rifle, though he knew it was useless. He'd fired at the lights. He'd fired at shapes in the dark. The bullets never seemed to matter. The hum grew louder. From the tree line, the orbs appeared again, one by one, like lanterns carried by invisible hands. They drifted into camp, bathing everything in pale blue glow. And from behind them stepped Tom. Tom's skin was ashen, stretched tight over his bones. His boots were gone, feet blackened with frostbite, but he walked without pain. His eyes were empty pits, and when he smiled, his lips cracked. "Eddie," Tom whispered, "you don't have to fight anymore. Just listen." Eddie raised the rifle. "Stay back." But Tom only tilted his head, just like Rick had. "There's no back. There's no leaving. Don't you understand? We're part of it now." Eddie's hands shook. He wanted to shoot, but he couldn't bring himself to fire. Because beneath Tom's voice, he heard others. Rick's voice, yes, but also his own father, his brother, his first love, all calling his name from the dark. "Eddie, come home." The lights pulsed. The hum grew. Eddie clamped his hands over his ears, but the voices pressed inside his skull. His nose bled. His vision swam. Eddie fled. He left the fire, the gear, everything. He ran into the night, crashing through snow and brush, branches slashing his face. The lights followed, gliding between the trees, faster than his stumbling feet. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't care. He just needed to escape. At last, he stumbled into a ravine, the same one where Rick's tracks had ended. The rock wall loomed before him, black and slick with ice. He turned, rifle raised, but the lights were already there, lining the ravine like a twisted procession. Tom stepped forward, arms outstretched. "Eddie, it's time." The voices surged louder, filling every crevice of Eddie's mind. He screamed, dropped the rifle, and clawed at his ears. The rock wall behind him seemed to pulse with the same heartbeat as the lights. For one impossible moment, the stone itself rippled like water disturbed by a pebble. And from it, shapes emerged. Not men, not animals. Tall, distorted silhouettes, their limbs too long, faces blurred, like shadows peeled from the earth. They reached for him. Eddie's last thought before the darkness swallowed him was Gus Heller's warning. Don't follow the voices. Don't follow the lights. But it was too late. 2 weeks later, Gus returned with his plane. The camp was empty. The tents were torn, gear scattered, rifles lying in the moss. No blood, no bodies. Only 3 sets of boot tracks leading into the ravine, and barefoot prints leading back out. But those prints weren't heading toward civilization. They were heading deeper into the Brooks Range. Gus refused to search. He flew back to Fairbanks, filed a report, and when asked what he thought happened, he shook his head. "Those men didn't get lost," he muttered. "They got taken." To this day, hunters still vanish in the Brooks Range. Some say the land itself swallows them. Others whisper about the lights, the voices, and the barefoot shadows that roam between the ridges. And every so often, around a fire beneath the aurora, someone swears they hear it. Faintly at first, but growing clearer. A voice, calling their name. The Anton Anderson Memorial Tunnel, known simply as the Whittier Tunnel, cuts deep through the Chugach Mountains of Alaska. It stretches for 2.5 miles under solid granite, a single-lane passage where cars must wait their turn to travel in timed convoys. During the day, the tunnel hums with fans and lights, its narrow concrete walls dripping with condensation. But at night, when the last vehicles have gone through and the entrance gates are closed, the tunnel becomes something else entirely. A black artery pulsing beneath the mountains, silent, endless, alive. Locals whisper that the tunnel holds secrets from long before it became a highway. During World War II, the U.S. Army built it to connect the hidden military base at Whittier to the rest of Alaska. Soldiers worked in the dark, carving through unforgiving rock. Many died in cave-ins, accidents, or from the crushing isolation. Some say their bodies were never recovered, sealed forever within the walls. And some claim that when the lights go out, those soldiers still walk the tunnel, carrying lanterns that glow like pale fire. In October of 2006, Jake Monroe, a 34-year-old maintenance worker, was assigned the night watch at the Whittier Tunnel. His job was simple: inspect the ventilation systems, check for water leaks, and make sure no one trespassed after hours. Jake was a practical man, not the type to scare easily. He'd worked construction in Anchorage, fought in bar brawls, and once spent a winter trapping alone in the interior. But the tunnel unnerved him. The way the lights flickered, how the echoes of his own footsteps followed too closely, almost like someone or something was keeping pace just behind him. On his first week of night shifts, an older co-worker named Ron warned him, "If you see lights that don't belong, don't follow them. Just keep walking. And if you hear someone calling for help, you didn't hear nothing." Jake laughed it off. just as Tom had in the Brooks Range story. But that laugh felt hollow in the tunnel's belly. On his third night, Jake parked his truck near the Bear Valley entrance. The gates were closed, the last train long gone, the road outside silent except for a steady drizzle. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped into the tunnel. The air was damp, thick with the smell of rust and earth. Overhead, fluorescent lights buzzed, spaced far apart so that every 100 feet or so, there was a pool of light followed by a stretch of darkness. Jake's boots echoed against the concrete, the sound bouncing back to him in strange rhythms, as if another pair of boots walked just out of sync. Halfway through the tunnel, the lights flickered. Then, for a moment, they went out. Jake froze. The blackness was absolute, suffocating. He couldn't even see his hands in front of his face. Heart hammering, he switched on his flashlight. That's when he saw it. Far ahead, where his beam barely reached, floated a pale glow. Not the harsh fluorescence of the tunnel bulbs. Softer, warmer, like a lantern. It bobbed gently, as if carried by someone walking. "Ron?" Jake called, though he knew Ron wasn't on shift that night. His voice carried, echoing in endless repetitions down the tunnel. The lantern light paused. Then it swayed, side to side, almost beckoning. Jake felt his legs move before his brain could stop them. He walked forward, drawn by something he couldn't explain. His flashlight flickered. The air grew colder. But as he closed the distance, the light drifted backward, always just out of reach. Jake quickened his pace, boots striking hard against the concrete. The glow remained steady ahead, pulsing faintly, never closer, never farther. "Hey!" he shouted, frustration mixing with fear. "Who's down here?" No answer, just the steady hum of the ventilation fans. Then, faintly, a voice. "Help me!" Jake stopped dead. The voice was soft, hollow, like it came from inside the walls themselves. "Please, don't leave me here." His throat went dry. Every instinct told him to turn around, to run back toward the truck, but his body wouldn't obey. The voice was too human, too desperate. He thought of the old stories, miners sealed alive, soldiers crushed by cave-ins. What if someone really was trapped? He stepped forward again. The lantern glow bobbed, waiting. Jake followed the glow deeper into the tunnel, his boots slapping against wet concrete. The walls seemed to close in, the ceiling pressing lower. The air tasted metallic, heavy, as though he were breathing rust. The glow bobbed just ahead, never more than 30 yards away. Sometimes it seemed closer, other times farther, but it always moved with him. "Help me!" The voice returned, clearer this time. It was a man's voice, strained, hoarse. Jake's flashlight beam shook across the damp walls. Water dripped steadily, echoing like ticking clocks. He tried the radio at his belt. "Base, this is Monroe. Do you copy?" "Static." He tried again. Nothing. The glow pulsed once, brighter, and Jake thought he saw a shadow behind it. A figure, human-shaped. "Hey!" Jake shouted. "Stay right there! I'm coming!" The glow retreated, faster now, weaving side to side. Jake cursed and broke into a jog. About a mile in, the tunnel changed. The walls no longer looked like smooth concrete. In the dim glow, they seemed jagged, raw, as though the tunnel had reverted to uncut stone. The overhead lights were gone. No wires, no fixtures, just endless rock swallowing him whole. Jake slowed, his chest heaving. What the hell? He glanced back. The entrance was gone. Only darkness stretched behind him, as though the tunnel had no beginning. The glow swayed, waiting. "Not possible," Jake muttered. He pressed a hand to the wall. It was damp, slimy, like the inside of a cave. His flashlight flickered, threatening to die. That's when the second voice came. "You're not supposed to be here." Jake spun, light whipping across the rock. Nothing, only dripping water and shadows. "Who's there?" Silence. Then footsteps, many footsteps, echoing all around. The first glow was no longer alone. Ahead, more appeared. 1, 2, 5, a dozen, lining the tunnel like a funeral procession. Lanterns swaying gently, casting pale halos that barely pierced the black. Within the glow of each, Jake thought he saw faces. Hollow-eyed men in old uniforms, their cheeks sunken, helmets dented. Their boots shuffled against stone, but their mouths never moved. Jake froze, heart hammering so loud it drowned the sound of dripping water. The lead lantern tilted. The soldier holding it raised an arm, skeletal fingers curling, pointing at Jake. The voices returned, overlapping, dozens at once. "Help us. Stay with us. We're cold." Jake stumbled backward. "No, no, no, no." The lanterns advanced. Jake turned and ran. His flashlight beam jolted wildly across the jagged tunnel, catching on cracks and wet rock. Behind him, the voices rose in a deafening chorus, no longer begging but commanding. "Stay! S-T-A-Y." The ground trembled. Dust fell from the ceiling. Ahead, the tunnel split into 2 passages. Impossible, Jake thought, because he knew the Whittier tunnel had only one straight path. The left passage glowed faintly with lantern light. The right yawned pitch black. Jake didn't think. He chose the dark. He sprinted into the void, lungs burning until the voices dulled to whispers. Finally, he collapsed against the wall, clutching his knees, his flashlight beam weak and sputtering. That's when he heard breathing, not his own, slow, heavy, just behind his shoulder. Jake swung the light. The beam caught a man's face inches from his own, skin pale and stretched, eyes hollow pits, mouth slack and dripping water. His helmet bore the insignia of a World War II regiment. Jake screamed. The man opened his mouth wider, impossibly wide, and the lantern light poured from his throat. Jake stumbled backward, his scream echoing until it was swallowed by the cavernous dark. The soldier's lantern light face stretched into a hollow grin, and then, like smoke, it dissolved, leaving only the lingering glow that sank into the walls. Jake's flashlight gave one last weak flicker and died. He was left in absolute black. The sound of footsteps surrounded him again, closer than before, boots on stone, dozens of them. A cold hand brushed his shoulder, then another at his back. "Stay. Stay with us. Forever." Jake bolted, hands scraping against the walls as he ran blind. The tunnel seemed to twist and shift beneath him, the floor uneven, the air thick with mold and smoke. "Let me out," he shouted, voice cracking. "I'm not one of you." But the soldiers answered with a single, unified whisper that chilled his marrow. "Now you are." Jake burst into a cavern. He could sense the space, vast, echoing, wet. He dropped to his knees, gasping, and his hand touched something solid. Metal. A helmet. Rusted, still damp with decades-old blood. His other hand grazed a boot, with bones still inside. Then another, and another. He realized he was kneeling in a mound of skeletal remains, hundreds of them, piled high like a forgotten grave. Jake's throat tightened. His flashlight was dead, but the faint lantern glows began to fill the cavern again, circling him. The soldiers were all here now, silent, watching, their hollow faces lit from within. One stepped forward, uniform tattered, jaw missing. He held out his lantern and spoke in a voice like crumbling stone. "We were buried here. The tunnel sealed us in. No one came back. No one remembered. But you found us. And you will stay with us. Jake shook his head violently. No, I can't. The soldier's lantern swung low, spilling light across the floor. The mound of bones writhed. Fingers clawed free, ribs shifted, skulls turned to face him. The dead were waking. The first hand grabbed Jake's ankle. He kicked, but more hands shot out, skeletal and relentless, wrapping around his legs, his wrists, his chest. No! Jake shrieked, thrashing wildly. His boots cracked bones, but the dead held fast. The mound dragged him downward, into its depth, into the grave of forgotten men. The lantern light dimmed as the weight of bodies closed over him. Dirt filled his mouth. Bones pressed into his ribs until he could no longer scream. The last thing he heard was the soldier's whisper, right at his ear. Now you are one of us. 2 days later, rescue workers entered the Whittier Tunnel after receiving frantic reports from Jake's supervisor. His truck was found still running at the entrance. His hard hat lay just inside, abandoned. They searched every inch of the tunnel. Concrete walls, straight passage. Nothing unusual. Jake Monroe was never found. But one worker swore, as they were leaving, that he saw something strange. Far down the tunnel, where no light reached, a faint lantern glow swayed back and forth. And just for a moment, he thought he saw a line of soldiers standing in silence. And among them, Jake. His face pale, eyes hollow, holding a lantern of his own. The Kenai Peninsula was a wild stretch of Alaska, a place where towering spruce trees seemed to claw at the sky and fog rolled low across the mossy ground like restless spirits. The deeper you went into the Kenai forest, the quieter it became. No birdsong, no wind through the branches, just an eerie, heavy silence. Locals whispered about a place buried deep inside that forest, a cabin. No one knew who built it. Some said a trapper in the late 1800s. Others claimed it was a prospector who went mad during the gold rush. But all agreed on one thing: the black cabin was cursed. Over the years, hunters who stumbled across it never came back. Hikers who dared to step inside were found days later, wandering in circles, minds shattered, babbling about shadows that breathe. And a few, well, they were never found at all. Most locals avoided the subject entirely. They would cross themselves if it was mentioned at bars in Soldotna or Seward. But for 3 college friends from Anchorage, Evan, Claire, and Marcus, the cabin wasn't something to fear. It was a dare. It had started as a late-night conversation over beers. Marcus had read about the black cabin on an old Alaskan forum where anonymous posters traded ghost stories and urban legends. "They say it's still standing," Marcus said, his eyes wide with excitement. "Deep in Kenai Forest. Some people say it moves, like it's never in the same place twice." Claire scoffed. "A moving cabin? That's ridiculous. Probably just drunk hunters getting lost." Evan leaned back, thoughtful. He wasn't as quick to dismiss it. "I've heard about it too. The black cabin. Supposedly when you go inside, it feels wrong. Like the air is too heavy. Like the walls are breathing." That was all it took. 3 weeks later, they were trudging through the damp, fog-choked forest, backpacks weighed down with supplies, GPS clipped to their packs, determined to find what so many others couldn't. The first day was uneventful. They hiked along narrow game trails, setting up camp near a creek. The forest seemed ordinary then, dark but not unfriendly. The second day was harder. The trees grew denser, the moss thicker, the silence heavier. By the third day, Claire started noticing things. Small things at first. "Did you hear that?" she whispered when they stopped for water. "Hear what?" Evan asked, but Marcus was already looking around. Sounded like tapping on wood. They stood still, listening. Nothing. Just the thick silence pressing in. That night, as they sat around their campfire, Claire swore she saw a movement between the trees. A shape, tall and still, watching them. But when she blinked, it was gone. "Maybe the cabin's close," Marcus said, grinning, though his smile was nervous. On the morning of the fourth day, they found it. The fog was thick, rolling between the trees, when Marcus stopped suddenly and pointed. "There!" At first, it looked like another cluster of trees, a darker shadow in the mist. But as they approached, the outline sharpened. Logs, stacked and blackened with age. A roof sagging under decades of rot. Windows so dark it was impossible to tell if the glass was still there. The cabin. It stood crooked in a small clearing, surrounded by dead trees whose branches hung like skeletal arms. Moss clung to the walls, and the air around it was colder, heavy with the scent of damp earth and mildew. Claire shivered. "I hate this place." Evan stepped forward, drawn to it. "We came all this way." "We're not turning back now." Marcus was already pulling out his camera. "This is insane. Nobody's gonna believe this." They circled the cabin slowly. There was no path leading to it, no signs of anyone living there for decades, maybe longer. The door was half-hinged, hanging slightly open. When Evan pushed it, the wood groaned like an animal in pain. Inside, the air was colder still, and the smell of rot was overwhelming. The floor was warped, covered in dirt and leaves. Cobwebs hung like curtains, and in the corner stood a broken chair. But it wasn't just abandoned. It felt wrong. Claire clutched her arms. "Do you feel that?" Marcus was grinning nervously, panning his camera across the interior. "Like we're being watched?" "Yeah. Perfect for the video." Evan stood in the center, his eyes fixed on the walls. The logs were black, not just rotted, but burnt, as if scorched from the inside. When he touched them, they were warm. The cabin seemed to exhale. A low creak rolled through the beams, as though it had been waiting for them. Evan whispered, "It's not empty." And somewhere deep inside the cabin, in the dark beyond the back wall, something knocked. 3 slow, deliberate raps. Knock, knock, knock. The knock echoed through the cabin like it came from the bones of the building itself. The 3 friends froze, their breath visible in the cold air. Marcus lowered his camera. "Tell me one of you did that." Evan shook his head, his face pale. "The sound came from inside the wall." Claire grabbed his sleeve. "Evan, we need to go. Right now. This place isn't..." Another knock, louder, closer knock. Knock, knock. The sound rattled the floorboards beneath their feet. Dust rained down from the ceiling. The cabin groaned as if it were alive. They backed toward the door, but before they could step out, something scraped along the walls. Long, slow scratches. Evan turned, eyes wide. The marks were appearing in real time. Thin, jagged gouges crawling across the blackened logs. No hand held the tool. No body made the motion. The scratches just appeared, dragging themselves from one end of the wall to the other. Claire covered her mouth. "It's writing." The gouges spelled out words, jagged and uneven. "Stay." Marcus stumbled backward, camera trembling in his hand. "It knows we're here." Despite every instinct screaming to leave, Evan moved deeper into the cabin. It was like something pulled him forward, a whisper in his skull that wasn't his own voice. At the far end was a door. Unlike the sagging main entrance, this one was solid. Black wood, iron hinges, no dust. It looked maintained. Evan reached for the handle. Claire grabbed his arm, panic flooding her voice. "Don't! Please don't!" But Evan twisted the handle. The door opened without resistance. Inside was a single room, bare, empty, except for the walls. Dozens, no, hundreds of scratches covered every inch of the wood, layered over each other like a prison wall marked by desperate hands. Marcus lifted his flashlight. His breath caught in his throat. They weren't scratches. They were names. Some carved deep, others faint, as if by fingernails. He read them aloud in a shaking whisper. James Harper, Mary Olden, Cole Ramsey. Claire recognized one. That's the hiker who disappeared in '96. I remember reading about him. The air grew heavier. The walls seemed to lean inward, the names shifting in the light. And then they heard it. A faint chorus of whispers, overlapping, pleading. Don't stay, don't stay, don't stay. The door slammed shut behind them. The room plunged into darkness. Evan pounded on it, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder, frantic now. It's awake, it's awake, run! Marcus's flashlight flickered. In the strobing beam, the names on the wall seemed to writhe, the letters bending and stretching into shapes that weren't words anymore. Faces, mouths. A pale hand pressed out of the wood, fingers stretching unnaturally long, clawing the air. Then another, and another. Dozens of hands, all reaching from the walls, each belonging to one of the names carved there. Claire screamed as one hand brushed her cheek, cold and damp like something pulled from a grave. Evan shoved his shoulder into the door again. This time it gave way, flinging them back into the main room of the cabin. The cabin was alive now. The floorboards buckled under their feet like a heartbeat. The ceiling pulsed. The air was so heavy it pressed into their lungs. Marcus dropped his camera. It hit the floor with a crack, the lens splintering, but it kept recording, its red light blinking. Out! Evan shouted, shoving Claire toward the door. But the doorway had changed. The clearing outside was gone. Beyond the threshold, there was only blackness, deeper than night, an endless void. Claire sobbed. Where's the forest? Where's the trail? The cabin groaned, and a low moan rose from beneath the floor. Something massive was shifting below, pressing upward, as though the whole structure was just the skin of something buried. Evan backed away from the door. His voice was barely a whisper. We're not in the forest anymore. The cabin exhaled. Every candle, every ember of their breath extinguished at once. They were left in absolute darkness. And in that dark, something began to crawl up from beneath the floorboards. The floorboards bulged upward, splintering as something enormous pressed from below. The cabin shook, its walls groaning like they were about to collapse. Marcus fell backward, flashlight clattering from his hand. The beam cut across the warped boards just as they split apart. A black, glistening hand erupted through the wood, long fingers, bent at impossible angles, slick with tar-like ooze. Claire screamed. Evan pulled her toward the far wall, but more hands burst through, clawing blindly at the air. From below came a guttural moan, low and endless, vibrating through the cabin's bones. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was something older, something that had been buried too long. The whispers from the walls rose into a panicked chorus. It wants you. Don't let it take you. Run! Run! The door slammed shut again, sealing the void outside. The windows were gone, replaced by walls of black wood, sweating and breathing. Marcus grabbed his broken camera, swinging it like a club at one of the skeletal hands reaching for him. It shattered, useless. "We're trapped," Claire sobbed. Evan's eyes darted around the room. In the far corner, behind the broken chair, he saw a faint glow seeping between the logs. Not natural light, something paler, colder. "There!" he shouted. They pushed toward it, shoving past the clawing hands, feet slipping on boards slick with black ooze. Evan slammed his shoulder against the wall. The wood cracked, the glow spilling through wider. On the third hit, the wall gave way, splintering outward into a blinding white void. They stumbled out, choking on the cold air. It wasn't the forest, not the one they came from. This place looked like a mirror of it, but bleached white, every tree pale and skeletal, their branches brittle as bone. The ground was coated in frost, though no snow had fallen. Behind them, the cabin groaned, its door yawning open like a mouth. Black ooze leaked across the frost, spreading outward in jagged veins. Marcus grabbed Evan's arm. "We can't go back in. We'll find another way out. There has to be." The trees shifted. Every trunk, every branch leaned slightly toward them, as if listening. Claire clutched her head, her voice breaking. "They're whispering. Do you hear it?" Evan did. The forest was alive with murmurs, endless and overlapping. Names, pleas, warnings. The same voices from the cabin walls, carried into this place. Stay, stay forever. They ran, through the pale trees, over the frost-crusted ground, lungs burning. But the forest had no end. Every path bent back on itself, leading them in circles. Marcus was the first to stumble. His legs sank into the frost up to the knee. He screamed, clawing at the ground as it sucked him down like quicksand. Evan and Claire grabbed him, pulling desperately, but the frost tightened its grip, pulling him deeper. His scream cut off as the white swallowed him whole. Claire shrieked, her hands bloody from scraping at the frozen earth. "He's gone! Evan, he's gone!" Evan pulled her to her feet. "We keep moving. We don't stop." But Claire didn't move. Her eyes were wide, locked on something behind him. Evan turned. The cabin had followed them. It stood crooked between the white trees, impossibly close, though they had run miles. Its door was open. Inside, the darkness seethed. Claire broke. She ran blindly into the trees, screaming. Evan chased her, but the forest bent, curving her path back toward the cabin. He saw her hit the clearing, saw her stumble at the door. Hands erupted from the threshold, dozens of them, yanking her inside before she could even scream. The door slammed shut. Evan fell to his knees, gasping, tears freezing on his face. He was alone now. The forest whispered louder. The ground beneath him cracked. The frost spread up his boots, climbing his legs, pulling him down. As the cold consumed him, his eyes locked on the cabin one last time. Its door swung open, and for a brief second, he thought he saw Marcus and Claire inside, standing among the others, their faces pale, eyes hollow, mouths moving in endless whispers. The frost closed over Evan's mouth. His scream was swallowed. The cabin groaned once, satisfied, and then it vanished into the trees, waiting for the next ones to find it. Weeks later, a search party combed the Kenai forest after the 3 students failed to return. Their campsite was found abandoned, supplies scattered, a camera broken in the dirt. When they played the footage back, the last recorded frame showed the interior of a dark cabin. The walls were covered in names, and just before the tape cut to static, another name appeared. scratched into the wood by invisible hands. Evan Rourke, Claire Jennings, Marcus Cole. The Alaskan coastline stretched endlessly, jagged cliffs rising from dark waters, waves slamming into the rocks like fists. The town of Portlock hadn't appeared on any official maps in decades. Some locals said it was erased on purpose, buried under silence. Others said it was never meant to be there in the first place. But Jonah Kessler wanted answers. He wasn't a believer in ghost stories. He was a marine biologist, a man of science. Yet the legends of Portlock had followed him since childhood. Stories of fishermen found torn apart on the shore, of hunters vanishing without a sound, of an entire village that abandoned its homes overnight, leaving pots still on stoves, food still half-eaten. His grandfather used to tell him, "Never set foot in Portlock, Jonah. The land there remembers blood. It takes more every time someone tries to return." Jonah thought it was superstition, a tale to keep kids in line. But now, standing on the deck of a small charter boat heading into the Gulf of Alaska, he couldn't shake the weight of those words. The boat's captain, an old Aleut man named Elias, didn't speak much. He only muttered once as they approached the fog-choked shoreline. "You shouldn't be here." The dead don't stay quiet in Portlock. The boat scraped against the dock, a sagging, rotted thing half sunk into the water. Jonah hoisted his pack and stepped off. The air was damp, heavy with the smell of salt and decay. Ahead lay the ruins of Portlock. The first thing he noticed was the silence. No gulls, no wind. Even the waves seemed to hush as they reached the shore. The village sat in ruin, cabins collapsing under moss and rot, windows shattered, roofs caved in. Fishing nets lay tangled in mud, brittle with age. Rusted tools rested where they had been dropped 70 years ago. It was as if time had stopped the day the villagers fled. Jonah pulled out his camera, documenting everything: the rotted cannery, the overgrown paths, the church leaning sideways as though the forest itself was swallowing it. His academic mind buzzed with questions. What could drive an entire community to abandon their lives overnight? Disease? Starvation? Fear? But the deeper he went into the village, the heavier the air became. It was near the old cannery that Jonah found it. At first, he thought it was driftwood tangled in the rocks. But when he got closer, his stomach turned. It was bones, human bones, picked clean, arranged in a crude shape of a cross. The skull was missing. Jonah swallowed hard, his rational mind scrambling. Maybe it was staged. Maybe vandals or cultists had come here years ago. But the bones looked fresh. Too fresh. A sound broke the silence. A splash. Jonah spun toward the shore. The water was still, the fog thick. Nothing moved. He tightened his grip on his pack and forced himself deeper into the village. The church was the largest building left standing. Its steeple leaned dangerously, and the door sagged off its hinges. Jonah pushed inside, dust billowing up around him. Pews lay broken, hymnal books scattered and chewed by rodents. The altar was overturned, the cross split in two. But the walls, Jonah froze at the sight of them. Names, hundreds of names carved into the wood in frantic, jagged letters. The oldest were faint, almost worn smooth by time. The newest looked fresh, as if carved yesterday. At the bottom of the list, half finished, was a single word: J-O-N. Jonah staggered back, his chest tightening. His name. Someone had been carving his name. A shadow flickered in the corner of the church. He whipped his flashlight toward it. The beam caught something, tall, hunched, its skin slick as if wet, crouched just beyond the altar. Two eyes glowed in the dark, and then it was gone. Jonah bolted from the church, breath sharp, heart hammering. He didn't stop until he reached the shore where Elias's boat had been tied. But the dock was empty. The rope dangled loose, the water rippling gently. The boat was gone. The fog pressed in tighter, muffling the world. That was when he heard it, a low, rhythmic sound. Thum, thum, thum. Like drums, distant, but drawing closer. It echoed off the cliffs, vibrating in his bones. Jonah turned in a circle, trying to pinpoint the source, but the fog twisted the sound until it seemed to come from everywhere. And then, from the corner of his eye, he saw movement among the ruined cabins, tall shadows gliding silently between them, too long, too thin, their heads brushing the sagging roofs. The drums grew louder, and Jonah realized, with a shudder that sank deep into his bones, that Portlock wasn't abandoned. It had never been abandoned. The fog pressed against Jonah's skin like wet cloth, suffocating, blinding. The sound of drums echoed through the ruined streets, steady, unrelenting, as though the very earth had begun to beat. Thum, thum, thum. He staggered backward, flashlight beams slicing through the mist. The shadows between the cabins were shifting, elongated figures moving with a slow, deliberate grace. Their limbs bent wrong, too long, too fluid, like joints weren't fixed where they should be. Jonah's instincts screamed at him to run. But where? The boat was gone. The path through the forest was overgrown and swallowed by fog. There was no escape. And then he heard it. Whispers. Dozens of voices speaking at once, in a language he couldn't understand. They rose and fell in rhythm with the drums, like a chant. Jonah clamped his hands over his ears. The voices weren't outside. They were inside his head. He stumbled blindly through the fog until he crashed into the side of a half-collapsed cabin. Desperate for cover, he pushed the door open and slipped inside. The stench hit him first. Rot, salt, blood. He raised his flashlight and froze. The walls were lined with skins, human skins, stretched flat, nailed into the wood as though they were trophies. Some were so old they had yellowed and cracked like parchment. Others glistened wet, fresh. A rasping breath came from the corner. Jonah's beam landed on a figure crouched in the shadows. At first he thought it was a man, but as it shifted, standing slowly, he realized it was something else entirely. Its body was impossibly tall, its arms dragging on the ground. Its face, or what should have been a face, was nothing but stretched skin, featureless, pulled too tight over bone. Jonah stumbled backward, his foot catching on broken floorboards. The creature tilted its head toward him, sniffing the air like a predator. And then it screamed. The sound was unlike anything human, a high, piercing shriek that rattled the glass in the windows. Jonah bolted from the cabin, crashing back into the fog. He didn't know how long he ran, only that his lungs burned and his legs ached. The fog thinned slightly, revealing a river cutting through the village. But the river wasn't water. It was bones. Thousands of them, flowing like a pale current. Skulls, ribs, spines, all clattering softly as if carried by an unseen tide. Jonah stood paralyzed at the edge. The river seemed endless, stretching back into the mist. And as he watched, shapes began to rise from it. Bodies, whole bodies, crawling upward from the tide of bones, dragging themselves onto the shore. Their mouths opened in silent screams, their eyes black voids that reflected nothing. One reached for him, its jaw snapping open wide enough to split its head in two. Jonah staggered back, slipping in the mud. The drums grew louder. Jonah fled again, his flashlight bouncing wildly. His mind screamed for logic, for science, for something that made sense. But there was nothing rational here. He burst through a thicket of brush and found himself at the shoreline once more. The tide had risen, waves slamming against the rocks. And then he saw them. Figures standing waist-deep in the water, motionless. Dozens of them. Their heads were bowed, their hair hanging limp and dripping. At first he thought they were survivors. But then, one lifted its head. Its face was pale, bloated, waterlogged. Its eyes hung loose in their sockets, swaying like jelly. Seaweed and barnacles clung to its jaw, wriggling with tiny crabs. One by one, the figures raised their heads. Their mouths opened in unison, and a low wail poured out, rising like a wave of grief and rage. Jonah fell to his knees, covering his ears. The sound burrowed into him, vibrating his skull. When he looked again, the drowned ones were moving toward him, dragging themselves onto the shore with jerking, unnatural movements. Jonah staggered back toward the village, desperate for shelter, desperate for anything. He found himself outside the church again, its broken steeple looming through the fog. He had no choice. He pushed inside. The names were still carved into the walls. But now there were more, dozens more. And at the bottom, fully carved now, was his name, Jonah Kessler. His blood ran cold. The wood beneath his name was fresh. Splinters curled from the letters as though carved minutes ago. He wasn't supposed to leave. His name was written. The drums that had thundered through the fog ceased all at once. The silence was worse. Jonah held his breath, waiting, listening. And then he heard footsteps. Slow, heavy, coming down the center aisle of the ruined church. He turned his flashlight. There it was. The figure from before, taller than any man, its skin glistening wet as though it had just risen from the sea. Its featureless face turned toward him, head tilting in a way no neck should move. Behind it, others emerged from the shadows, the drowned, the skinned, the bone walkers. They filled the church, their bodies pressing closer, surrounding him. Jonah's light flickered, dimmed, and in the pitch black, he finally understood why Portlock was abandoned. It wasn't abandoned. It was claimed. The church walls seemed to breathe. Jonah pressed his back against the pulpit, his flashlight flickering like a dying heartbeat. The air was heavy with the stench of rot and salt. Every shadow moved. Every sound echoed. The tall figure stepped closer, each footfall echoing like thunder across the warped floorboards. The others followed, filling the church with their silent procession. Their eyes, those who had them, glowed faintly in the dark, like lanterns drowned beneath the sea. Jonah tried to scream, but no sound came. His throat was tight, strangled. The whispers in his head grew louder, voices chanting in unison. "You are written. You are ours. You are the last." The floorboards buckled beneath Jonah's feet. He stumbled as the pulpit gave way, collapsing into darkness below. His flashlight clattered into the abyss, its beams spinning wildly before vanishing. He hit cold stone, his body jolting with pain. For a moment, he lay still, gasping, until he realized he was in a tunnel, carved into the rock, ancient. The walls glistened with moisture, the scent of sea brine and blood filling his lungs. The drums began again, fainter now, but steady, drawing him forward. Jonah crawled through the tunnel, his palms scraping against sharp rocks. The chanting never stopped. It pulsed in his skull, vibrating his teeth, commanding him to keep moving. The tunnel opened into a cavern. He froze. The chamber was vast, its ceiling lost in shadows. In the center was a pit, filled with black water that reflected nothing. Surrounding the pit were totems, wooden poles carved with faces twisted in agony, their mouths open in eternal screams. And around the pit knelt figures, dozens, maybe hundreds. Skin stretched thin over bone, some still dripping with seawater, others nothing but hollow husks. They swayed back and forth, chanting in unison. The tall figure emerged from the tunnel behind him, moving silently. It gestured toward the pit. Jonah shook his head violently. "No, no, please." The voices inside his skull screamed louder. His body convulsed. His legs carried him forward against his will, dragging him toward the pit. Jonah collapsed at the edge of the black water. His reflection looked back at him, except it wasn't his face. It was pale, bloated, skin torn, eyes black. He tried to scramble back, but skeletal hands reached from the water, clutching his arms, his legs, his throat. They were cold, so cold, their grip unbreakable. The drowned ones pulled him down, dragging him into the pit. The black water swallowed him whole. He didn't scream. He couldn't. The last thing he saw was the tall figure's featureless face leaning over the edge, watching, as though satisfied. And then there was only darkness. The next morning, the fog lifted. Fishermen passing along the coast swore they saw movement in the ruins of Portlock, windows glowing faintly, as if lanterns burned once more inside the cabins. And some swore they heard drums echoing faintly across the water. But when they asked who might still live there, the elders only shook their heads. "No one lives in Portlock," they said. "No one ever leaves Portlock." The mountain loomed above them like a frozen god. Denali, the high one, its jagged crown swallowed in clouds, its slopes gleaming under the pale Alaskan sun. For centuries, it had been a place of reverence and fear. For some, it was a test of strength. For others, a grave. Noah Reeves tightened the straps of his pack and glanced up the snowfield. Behind him, 3 other climbers adjusted their gear. His older brother Luke, a seasoned mountaineer. Hannah, a medic from Anchorage with quiet nerves of steel. And Miguel, a photographer chasing one last story before returning home. It was early June, prime climbing season, but the mountain didn't care. The winds were unpredictable, the storms merciless. Already they had heard stories whispered at base camp, groups who had gone missing, voices on the wind, lights seen dancing across the higher slopes where no one should be. Noah had laughed at first, ghost stories told by frostbitten climbers. But the longer he stared at Denali, the more uneasy he became. It wasn't just big. It wasn't just cold. It was alive. Their first night at base camp was restless. The tents rattled under the wind, snow drifting against the nylon walls. Outside, the silence was oppressive, broken only by the groan of the glacier shifting beneath them. Around a stove in the mess tent, another team of climbers spoke in hushed voices. "They found a tent last week at 14,000 feet, one said, stirring his coffee with shaking hands. "Still zipped shut, ropes neatly coiled, food untouched, but the climbers, gone, no tracks leading away. Just vanished." Miguel raised an eyebrow. "Maybe they fell into a crevasse." The man shook his head. "We checked. No signs, no blood. Nothing." Luke dismissed it with a grunt, but Hannah's eyes lingered on the storyteller. She wasn't one to scare easily, but there was a tension in her face Noah didn't like. That night, as Noah lay awake in his sleeping bag, he thought he heard something under the howling wind. A low, mournful wail, rising and falling like voices carried on the storm. He told himself it was the mountain, ice shifting, nothing more. But deep down, he wasn't sure. The first days were grueling. Each step up the snow-packed trail felt heavier than the last. The air thinned quickly, burning lungs and making every movement a battle. Noah focused on Luke's boots ahead of him, one after another, an unbroken rhythm. Miguel snapped photos whenever he could, capturing the endless white, the jagged ridges, the dark shadows that stretched across the glacier like claw marks. But sometimes, when Noah looked back, he saw more. Once, he swore there was a fifth climber in their line, a dark figure trudging behind Miguel, its head bowed, its gait stiff. But when he blinked, it was gone, leaving only the four of them and their rope. Another time, Hannah shouted suddenly, waving at the horizon. "Avalanche!" They braced, but nothing came. The slope ahead was calm, empty. She frowned, lowering her arm. I thought I saw something move." They kept going, but the silence pressed heavier. It wasn't just the cold now, it was the feeling of being watched. By the third night, they reached the 11,000-foot camp. The tents flapped against sharp winds, snow pelting like nails. They huddled inside, drinking meltwater and chewing stale rations. Miguel scrolled through the photos on his camera, a frown deepening on his face. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. He turned the screen toward them. The photos showed the four of them climbing in single file across the snowfield. But behind them, faint but visible, was another figure. A tall, thin shadow, standing upright against the wind. Luke shook his head. "Snowdrift. Illusion. Don't read into it." But Hannah crossed herself quietly, her lips moving in a prayer. Noah stared at the photo long after the others had put it away. The figure's posture was wrong, too straight, too still, and its face, or where the face should have been, was nothing but blank white. That night, Noah couldn't sleep. The storm howled outside, rattling the tent poles. At first it was just the wind, but then it changed. He sat upright, holding his breath. It wasn't wind anymore. It was words. "Noah!" His heart lurched. The voice was faint, but it was there, a whisper curling between the gusts. "Noah, come higher." He scrambled for his flashlight, shining it against the tent walls. Shadows flickered outside, long and thin, moving against the direction of the storm. He wanted to wake the others, but fear rooted him in place. If he spoke, if he moved, he was certain whatever was outside would know. He sat frozen until dawn, listening to the mountain call his name. The storm cleared by morning, but Noah couldn't shake the memory of the voice. The others looked worn too, dark circles under Hannah's eyes, Miguel uncharacteristically quiet, Luke more irritable than usual. They roped together and pushed higher, the glacier groaning beneath their crampons. The slope steepened, forcing them to zigzag across the white expanse. It was Miguel who spoke first. "Do you hear it?" They paused. The wind was calm, the air unnervingly still. And yet, beneath the silence, there was something else. A low hum, almost like chanting. Luke scowled. "It's the altitude. You're hearing things." But Noah knew it wasn't just altitude. The sound was real, and it was getting louder. By midday, the group spotted another climbing team ahead, 4 silhouettes trudging slowly across the snow ridge. Relieved to see other people, they picked up their pace. But no matter how fast they climbed, the figures never grew closer. Always the same distance away. Hannah was the first to notice. "They're not leaving tracks." Noah blinked. She was right. The ridge behind the figures was untouched, pristine snow. Luke swore under his breath. "Keep moving. Don't look." But Noah couldn't stop. He stared at the shadows ahead until the clouds shifted and the figures dissolved into mist. At 14,000 feet, they reached another established camp. Several tents were pitched in neat rows, flapping gently in the wind. But no one answered their calls. They checked the first tent. Inside were sleeping bags, food, and gear. Still warm, as if abandoned only hours ago. The second tent was the same. Everything in order. No signs of struggle, but no climbers. Miguel whispered, "It's the story from base camp. They're gone." Hannah's hand trembled as she unzipped the third tent. Inside, a journal lay open on the floor. The last entry read, "The shadows are inside now. They stand at the walls. They wait for us to sleep." Luke snapped the book shut. "We're not staying here. Pack up." Now, the higher they climbed, the more the mountain seemed to twist reality. Snow shimmered in unnatural colors, the sun flickering like a strobe through the shifting clouds. Miguel lagged behind, his camera hanging loose around his neck. "I keep seeing them," he muttered, "out of the corner of my eye. People. Dozens of them." Watching Noah opened his mouth to answer when Miguel slipped. One moment he was there, the next he was gone, tumbling silently down the slope. Their ropes snapped tight, jerking Noah forward. Luke and Hannah dug in their ice axes, holding the line taut. They peered over the edge, expecting to see Miguel dangling below, but the rope was slack, empty. The line ended in frayed strands, as though something had sliced it clean. Miguel was gone. No body, no blood, nothing. Only the endless white. Shaken, the three remaining climbers pressed on, too afraid to linger. The wind howled around them, filling every silence with phantom voices. At dusk, they stopped to rest. Noah wandered a few feet from the tents, scanning the horizon. That's when he saw them. Symbols carved into the snow. Dozens of them, spiraling outward in patterns too perfect to be random. Circles, lines, shapes like eyes staring skyward. He knelt, brushing snow from one of the grooves. The cut was deep, far deeper than any boot or tool could have made. And then he realized they weren't carved in the snow. They were carved from below. Something had reached up, pressing against the surface of the world itself, leaving its mark. The wind shifted, and Noah swore he heard his name again, whispered from beneath the snowpack. That night, Hannah vanished. No one saw her leave the tent. One moment she was asleep, curled in her bag. The next, Noah woke to silence. Her spot was empty, the tent flaps swaying open. They searched by headlamp, calling her name into the dark. Only the mountain answered, its endless echo mocking them. When they returned, Luke's face was pale, his jaw clenched. "We keep climbing. If we stop, we die here." But Noah couldn't shake the feeling that Hannah hadn't left. She'd been taken. And whatever took her wasn't finished. The mountain was silent now. Too silent. Noah trudged behind Luke, every step heavier than the last. His legs trembled, his lungs burned, but fear kept him moving. Two gone, Miguel and Hannah, swallowed by Denali without a trace. The summit was still days away, but Luke refused to turn back. His eyes were wild, feverish, like a man possessed. "We finish," he muttered through chapped lips. "We finish what we came here for." Noah wanted to argue, but the words died in his throat. Deep down, he knew it wouldn't matter. The mountain wasn't letting them go. They crossed another ridge, roped together, when Noah saw them again. Figures. A line of climbers ahead, moving in perfect unison, their bodies stiff, jerking like puppets on strings. Luke ignored them, pulling the rope tight. "Don't look. Keep moving." But Noah couldn't look away. The figures turned their heads in unison, faces pale, eyes black voids. One raised a hand, beckoning him forward. The rope tugged hard. Noah blinked, and the ridge was empty. By nightfall, they reached a narrow plateau. Too exhausted to climb further, they pitched a tent. The storm returned, snow hammering the thin fabric, wind howling like wolves. Inside, Luke stared at the journal they'd taken from the vanished climbers. His hand shook as he flipped to the last page. It was filled with names. Hundreds of them. Some were crossed out, others freshly written. And at the bottom, etched in shaky handwriting, was Noah's. Noah Reeves. His stomach dropped. "No, that's not possible." Luke didn't look up. "It was already there when we found it." The storm screamed louder, rattling the tent poles. Noah grabbed Luke's arm. "We need to go down, now, before—" Luke's eyes burned with something Noah had never seen before. Desperation. Madness. "You don't get it, do you?" Luke hissed. "They've chosen us. That's why Miguel and Hannah are gone. That's why our names are here. We were meant to climb, to finish, to join them." Noah shook his head violently. "This isn't us. This isn't real." But before he could finish, the wind cut through the tent wall. Not tore cut. Like invisible hands had sliced it open. Snow blasted inside, and with it came the shadows. They weren't human anymore. The missing climbers poured in, their bodies rigid, their faces pale as frost. Their jaws hung open, spilling the sound of the storm. Noah grabbed his axe, swinging wildly, but the blade passed through them as if they were smoke. Still, the rope connecting him to Luke jerked tight. He turned. Luke was walking toward them, slowly, willingly. "No!" Noah screamed, pulling against the rope. "Luke, don't!" But Luke's eyes were empty, black pits staring at nothing. He stepped into the storm and was gone. The rope went slack. Noah stumbled backward, falling into the snow. The shadows closed in, circling him, their mouths whispering his name. Noah, Noah, Noah. He crawled to the edge of the ridge. Below him, nothing but a white abyss, an endless fall into frozen darkness. The voices grew louder. The journal in his pack burned against his spine, heavy with the weight of his written fate. For a moment, he thought he saw Hannah's face in the storm. Then Miguel's. Then Luke's. All pale, all smiling. "Join us," they whispered. "Join us in the white." Noah stood, his body trembling, his mind fracturing under the pressure of voices and wind. He staggered toward the edge, toes at the lip of the abyss. The storm swallowed the world. The shadows pressed close, their cold fingers brushing his skin. He took one last breath and stepped forward. The mountain accepted him. Weeks later, another team of climbers reached the same plateau. They found a single tent, torn open by wind. Inside, a journal lay half buried in snow. The final page was written in frantic, frozen ink. "The mountain takes what it wants. The white is alive. We are not lost. We are waiting." Below it, one last name had been added. Noah Reeves. Nome, Alaska. A windswept frontier town sitting on the edge of the Bering Sea. Most outsiders know it for the Iditarod Trail sled dog race or for its gold rush history. But those who live there long enough learn something else. Nome is a place where people vanish. Not just one or two, but dozens over the decades. Some disappear during storms, some while hunting, others while simply walking home from a bar. Bodies are rarely recovered. Locals whisper that it isn't just the brutal weather or the ice that claims them. It's something else. something older than the town itself. It always seems to happen beneath the northern lights. The story I'm about to tell you begins in the winter of 1998. A young schoolteacher named Caroline Hughes had just moved to Nome from Anchorage. She loved the idea of teaching in a small community and was captivated by the wild beauty of Alaska. But Caroline also kept a journal. And in that journal, she wrote about the nights when the aurora painted the sky green and violet. She described how, on those nights, she heard voices. Not human voices exactly, more like whispers carried on the wind. She said they came from the frozen sea itself. One night, in February, Caroline and two friends, David, a bush pilot, and Annette, a nurse, decided to go out onto the ice after dinner. The aurora was especially bright that night, shimmering like curtains of liquid fire across the sky. They bundled in heavy parkas, their breath steaming in the bitter air, and made their way past the last houses toward the frozen shoreline. Caroline stopped once they reached the edge of the sea ice. The green glow reflected across the glassy surface, stretching toward the horizon. "Listen," she said. Annette laughed, her cheeks red from the cold. "It's just the wind." But David frowned. He heard it too. A low, echoing murmur, like 100 voices speaking at once. Muffled, but insistent. The ice beneath them groaned, and Caroline whispered something that made both of her friends fall silent. "They're calling my name." The next morning, Caroline didn't show up for school. Her parka was found neatly folded on the ice, just past the last house. Her boots, too, were left behind, but there were no footprints leading away. Just a single crack in the ice, dark water swirling beneath. Annette swore Caroline had been standing only a few feet from her the night before. 1 second she was there. The next, gone. This was not the first disappearance in Nome, and it would not be the last. But the strangest part? Caroline's journal was later found inside her small rental home. The last entry was written the night she vanished. It said only, "The lights are closer tonight. If I follow them, maybe I'll understand. Maybe I'll see what they want me to see." Caroline's disappearance rattled the small community of Nome. People were used to hardship. Yes, storms, frostbite, even the occasional drowning when someone misjudged the sea ice. But Caroline wasn't drunk, wasn't reckless, and wasn't the kind of person to wander off without reason. The folded parka and boots. That was what made everyone uneasy. Who in their right mind would step barefoot onto ice at 20 below zero? Sheriff Dale Connors organized a search. Snowmobiles scoured the shoreline. Divers drilled through the frozen sea, lowering themselves into the black water below. Nothing. No body. No trace. And then there was Caroline's journal. Sheriff Connors read her final entry aloud to Annette, who shook her head violently. "She wouldn't write that." Caroline wasn't. She wasn't crazy. But David, the bush pilot, sat in silence, because he remembered the sound too, the voices beneath the aurora. That week, Nome was struck by a series of strange events. On February 17th, 2 hunters swore they saw bright shapes moving underneath the frozen sea, glowing with the same colors as the northern lights. One described it as a curtain of fire beneath the ice. On February 20th, a fisherman named Harold Pike vanished while walking back from the docks. His wife said she saw him stop suddenly in the middle of the street, look upward at the sky, and smile. When she blinked, he was gone. His boots remained in the snow. No tracks led away. By the end of February, the town was frightened, People locked doors, drew curtains, and prayed on nights when the aurora shone brightest. Annette couldn't let go of what happened to her friend. She began to dig into Nome's history, speaking with elders who remembered the old stories. Stories passed down long before white settlers arrived. One Inupiat elder told her about the Takiksurak, spirits of the lights. According to legend, they were hungry beings who roamed the frozen sky, luring the curious and the lonely into the dark. They play with us, the elder warned. If you whistle at the lights, they come closer. If you follow, they take you. Annette asked what happens to those taken. The elder shook her head. No one knows. They don't come back. On March 2nd, Annette persuaded David to join her on the ice again. She wanted to hear the voices, to prove they weren't imagining things. That night, the aurora was breathtaking. Ribbons of emerald and purple weaving across the black sky. The sea ice glowed faintly, as if lit from below. They stood in silence, breath clouding in the bitter air. And then, it began. A low, thrumming murmur. Not the wind, not the shifting ice. Words, countless overlapping whispers echoing upward from beneath the frozen sea. Annette's skin prickled. She could almost make them out. 100 voices calling, overlapping, beckoning. And yes, she swore she heard Caroline's voice among them. David grabbed her arm. We should go. But Annette took a step forward, staring down at the glowing ice. The voices grew louder. The aurora shimmered, almost pulsing with each breath of wind. For one terrible moment, she swore she saw faces beneath the ice. Pale, distorted, drifting upward as though pressing from the other side of glass. She screamed and stumbled back. The ice split open with a violent crack. Black water churned below, glowing faint green. Something rose toward the surface. David yanked her back just as the fissure widened. For a split second, Annette saw a pale hand break through the water. Thin, human-like, reaching. And then it was gone. The crack sealed itself with a groan. The whispers faded. The lights above dimmed. Annette collapsed in the snow, sobbing. David said nothing, but the look in his eyes told her what she already knew. Caroline hadn't fallen. She had been taken. Annette couldn't sleep for days after that night on the ice. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the hand pushing up from the black water. She heard Caroline's voice echoing in her ears, calling from somewhere far away. David refused to talk about it. He buried himself in his flying, taking supply runs to villages farther inland. But Annette noticed how he avoided the shoreline now. Whenever the aurora came, he drew the curtains tight. The town itself seemed to sink into paranoia. More disappearances followed. A boy walking home from school, a man shoveling snow outside his cabin, a woman who left the post office at dusk but never arrived home. In each case, only their boots were found, neatly set side by side in the snow. By mid-March, Nome felt cursed. Some families packed up and left altogether, heading south to Anchorage or even out of Alaska. But for those who stayed, there was no escape from the lights. Annette's breaking point came on March 19th. She was on duty at the small clinic when an elderly man was brought in, nearly frozen, babbling nonsense. He had been found crawling on the sea ice outside of town, his clothes half torn away, his face white with frostbite. Annette and another nurse wrapped him in blankets, trying to warm him. He kept whispering through cracked lips. They're under the ice. They wear the lights. Don't look up. Don't look up. Hours later, the man died. Annette went home and sat alone in the dark. She thought of Caroline, of the hunters, of the fisherman's smile before he vanished. The voices had taken them, and now they were calling to her too. She had to know why. On March 23rd, Annette left a note on her kitchen table. "If I don't come back, you'll know where I went." That night, the aurora was at its brightest yet. Waves of emerald fire rippling across the entire sky, so brilliant they cast shadows on the snow. Annette walked barefoot onto the ice, carrying nothing but a lantern and Carolyn's old journal. The cold burned her skin instantly, but she forced herself forward. The whispers rose almost immediately. Louder this time, clearer. They were calling her name. "Annette!" She knelt beside the fissure in the ice, the same one that had opened weeks before. The surface shimmered faintly, like glass fogged from beneath. Shapes swam in the darkness. And then she saw her. Caroline. Her face pale, hair floating as if underwater, eyes glowing faint green. She pressed her hands to the underside of the ice, lips moving soundlessly. Annette pressed her own hands to the surface, tears freezing on her cheeks. "Caroline, please." The whispers surged into a deafening chorus. Dozens of faces pressed upward through the ice. Men, women, children, all pale, all glowing with the light of the aurora. Annette's body trembled. She should have run, but instead she whispered, "Take me too." The ice split open. A blinding wave of green light poured upward, swallowing her whole. She felt herself dragged downward into the freezing dark, voices wrapping around her like chains, pulling her deeper, deeper. And then, silence. The ice sealed. Her lantern lay extinguished on the surface. Her boots sat neatly side by side in the snow. Nome still remembers Caroline Hughes, Harold Pike, Annette, and all the others. Locals don't talk about it openly, but every winter, when the northern lights blaze across the sky, they shut their doors, bolt their windows, and warn visitors not to wander. Some say the lights are just nature's beauty, but others, those who've lived long enough, know the truth. The lights are hungry, and they are always watching. Barrow, Alaska, now called Utqiagvik, is the northernmost town in the United States. It sits on the edge of the Arctic Ocean, a place where winter swallows the land whole. From November to late January, the sun never rises. For 65 endless days, the town lives in perpetual night. Most people can't imagine what that kind of darkness does to the mind. But those who live there know it changes everything. Shapes blur in the shadows. Time bends. The silence becomes unbearable. And sometimes, in that silence, you hear things that aren't supposed to be there. In the winter of 2004, a small team of scientists was stationed just outside Barrow. They were studying climate patterns, drilling ice cores, and monitoring ocean currents. It was routine work, important, but lonely. The team of 5 lived in a low prefab research module, its windows frosted over, its doors sealed against the brutal cold. Among them was Dr. Michael Anders, a 34-year-old climatologist from Oregon. He had always prided himself on being rational, skeptical, and immune to the paranoia that often plagued people up north. But even he felt the strain of the endless night. The first week passed quietly. They worked long hours, ate together, watched old VHS tapes on a tiny TV. But then came the first strange sound. It happened on December 3rd. Michael woke to the creak of footsteps just outside his room. Slow, measured, crunching on snow that wasn't there. He sat up, heart pounding, listening. The others were asleep. The hallway was empty. The next morning, he said nothing. He told himself it was his imagination. On December 5th, the team's generator faltered. Michael and another researcher, Lydia, went outside to check it. The sky above was black, the horizon only faintly glowing with aurora. Their breath froze instantly, and their headlamps illuminated only swirling snow. As Michael bent over the generator, Lydia grabbed his arm. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. He froze. From the darkness beyond their lights came a sound, faint but unmistakable. A low hum, almost like a voice. They turned their lamps toward the frozen tundra. Nothing, just wind and blowing snow. But Lydia swore she heard someone calling her name. That night, Michael checked the logs. For years, Barrow locals had reported strange disappearances during the polar night. Hunters who never came home, oil workers who vanished from their rigs, children who wandered too far from town. Most blamed the cold, or the storms, or alcohol. But Michael began to wonder, because he had heard the voice, too. By the second week of December, the research station no longer felt safe. Michael began hearing the footsteps every night now. Sometimes they paced the hallway outside his door. Other times they circled the entire module, crunching over the snow that wasn't there. The sound would stop the moment he opened the door or peered through a frost-coated window. He tried to tell himself it was pipes expanding or the wind shaking the structure. But deep down, he knew better. The others noticed it too. Lydia confessed one morning over coffee that she had woken up to the sound of breathing right beside her bed. When she turned on her flashlight, no one was there. Another researcher, Thomas, swore he saw a figure standing at the far end of the hall, tall, hunched, its head nearly scraping the ceiling. When he blinked, it was gone. The group grew restless, snapping at one another over small things. Sleep became impossible. The darkness outside pressed against the windows like a living thing. On December 12th, things escalated. Michael was reviewing ice core samples when the lights flickered. The generator rumbled, then steadied. But the shadows in the room seemed to stretch unnaturally long, curling across the floor like black smoke. And then, faintly, he heard it. A whisper. Not from the hallway this time, from directly behind him. He spun around, heart hammering. The room was empty, but the whisper lingered. Just 2 words, drawn out and breathless. "Come outside." That night, Thomas vanished. He had been working the midnight shift, logging atmospheric data. When Lydia went to relieve him, she found his parka missing, the door to the station left slightly ajar. Outside, the snow was unbroken. No footprints. They searched with floodlights, calling his name into the endless night. Nothing. When they returned inside, they found his boots neatly placed beside his bed. The team panicked. Lydia wanted to radio for emergency extraction, but a blizzard cut off the satellite link. They were trapped until the storm passed. Michael stayed awake, staring at the frost-covered window beside his bunk. Hours passed in silence. Then, through the ice-crusted glass, he saw a face, pressed against the outside of the window, pale, grinning, eyes clouded white. It was Thomas. Michael stumbled back, heart slamming against his ribs. The face lingered only a moment before fading into the swirling snow. But the next morning, when he told the others, they didn't laugh, because Lydia had seen the same thing. By mid-December, the storm had passed, but the research team was broken. No one slept. No one spoke much anymore. They kept the floodlights on all night, though it made little difference against the endless dark outside. Shadows still moved in the corners. Footsteps still circled the station. And always, there were whispers, soft, urgent, beckoning. Michael had stopped writing in the logbook. He no longer cared about the ice cores or the climate data. He only cared about surviving long enough to leave. But survival was slipping away from them. On December 18th, Lydia vanished. Michael woke to the sound of the station door slamming. He bolted from his bunk and ran down the hall, barefoot, breath steaming in the icy air. The outer door was open, snow blowing in. Her parka and boots were still inside. And there, in the distance, half hidden in the black horizon, he saw her, walking across the tundra in her nightclothes, head tilted back toward the aurora. "Lydia!" he screamed. She didn't turn, didn't stumble, didn't shiver. She just kept walking into the dark until the night swallowed her whole. Now only Michael and one other researcher remained, Sarah, the youngest of the team. They sat together in silence, the hum of the generator the only sound between them. "Do you think we'll make it?" Sarah asked one night. Michael wanted to lie, to reassure her, but the truth slipped out instead. "I don't think anyone makes it through the dark here." On December 21st, the longest night of the year, Sarah was the next to go. Michael woke to whispers surrounding his bed. Dozens of voices, male and female, young and old, all speaking at once. He bolted upright to see Sarah standing in the doorway, eyes clouded white, lips moving in time with the whispers. Before he could move, she stepped into the hall. He chased her, but the hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the walls bending and warping, the shadows twisting like black vines. She turned a corner and was gone. When Michael returned to her bunk, her boots were neatly placed beside it. Now, he was alone. The station groaned around him. The windows rattled with phantom knocks. The generator hummed lower, flickering the lights. He sat in the common room with a lantern, Caroline's old journal from Nome in his hands. Don't ask him how it got there. He didn't know. But the last page had changed. In fresh ink, written in a hand that wasn't his, were 3 words. "Come outside, Michael." On December 23rd, the rescue helicopter finally arrived. The storm had cleared. The research station stood silent and still, half buried in snow. The crew found no survivors. Inside, 4 pairs of boots were neatly placed beside their bunks. The 5th pair, Michael's, was gone. To this day, locals in Barrow tell stories of strange lights moving on the tundra during the long polar night, of footsteps echoing outside empty homes, of pale faces pressing against frosted windows, smiling. Some say it's just the isolation, the darkness playing tricks on the mind. But those who've lost someone up here know better. The dark doesn't just watch, it takes. And once it has you, there's no coming back.